Okay, so we are ready to begin, I think. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this briefing from the Foreign Press Association. My name is Kristen Salumi. I am, by day, a journalist with the Al Jazeera Network. Today, I'm going to be talking with Brooke Kroeger, author, former journalist, professor emeritus at NYU, about her latest book, Undaunted, about how women changed American journalism. And got the book right here. Brooke, thanks so much for being with us and talking about this really extensively researched book. There are so many recognizable names in the book. You know, a lot of us have probably heard of Nelly Bly, Ida Tarbell, and more recent legendary women from Gloria Steinem to Barbara Walters. But there's really a lot of names in here, a lot of people that I'd never heard of, a lot of details. And until now, I guess there really hasn't been a book like this to look at women writ large. Is that correct?
No, there has been one. There's been this one. Ladies, can you see it? Ladies of the Press by Ishbel Ross, a really important front page girl of the 20s and early 30s. It was written in 1936. And of course, there have been academic works of various kinds, but this was a trade book, and mine is a trade book, you know, meant for a general audience who might or might not be interested in this subject. And so this is the second effort, and how many years is that? A lot.
That's almost 100 years, though.
Yeah, almost 100 years, 90 something. She organizes very differently. She organizes by genre, you know, by travel correspondents, stunt girls, sob sisters, you know, front page girls, and then on, or by region, the Midwest, the East, the Far West, the Rocky Mountains, like that. So it's a very different approach because it skips around a lot. So you're not really able to follow the continuum, you know, the trajectory of what's really happening to women over time.
Right.
And I don't know if you found this, but I found this. It's a story of projects, progress, setback, push, pull, and that goes on right up to the present.
Absolutely. You see many of the same trends kind of repeating themselves over the years. But as you say, your book is more chronological, starting way back in 1840. I mean, it's unbelievable to think at that time, given what was expected of women, that they even managed to break through it all at that time. How would you characterize some of those early women, like Margaret Fuller? I think was one of, she couldn't even sign her name because she was a woman. She had to pretend.
I don't think that's true. Someone else said that the other day. I don't think that's true, because Mariah Child signed by her name, and others used their names or used pen names. So that was it was more common than people think. I think this was her choice, you know, that when she was at the Dial, she signed with an F. And when she got to the New York Tribune, she signed with an asterisk, which she called a star. And the fact is, she really was a star. She is, to me, the absolute it girl of the 1840s. She is ugly by her own description. She has off-putting quirks. People find her really repellent in many ways. And yet she's got this incredible gift of discourse. And she's erudite beyond measure. Her father has educated her. He has tutored and mentored her. Remember, most young women in 1840s, this is before Seneca Falls, this is before, you know, even the early beginnings of the suffrage movement, women went to charm school if they were educated. That's what they were trained to do. So she had divined very early on that women needed to be able to systematize knowledge, that they needed to be able to understand these things. This becomes a problem for women journalists for the next 100 years, that the understanding becomes, the stereotype is that women can't think, that women can't produce accurate copy, that they can write beautifully, they can write poems, they can write essays, they can write short stories, they can even write books, but they can't do the kind of thinking that's necessary to be a hardcore journalist. And of course, they treated it like it was a congenital defect for a very, very long time. So some of the problems women had later really stem from this conditioning that they partially accepted themselves. So that becomes very clear when you do this decade by decade by decade to see what's happening and what people are saying and who's succeeding and how they're surpassing these problems. They're getting over them and being able to function at a high level. Margaret Fuller, between 1840 and 1846, did everything in journalism that you or I would dream to do. She did everything, and mostly of her own choice, with Horace Greeley saying, "Sure, Margaret, go ahead." So it's amazing.
What was it that you think that allowed, you mentioned that her father educated her, but she also had a lot of connections, didn't she? And we see this early on, that the women that had the confidence and the ability to break through, it was usually, that was a big part of it, wasn't it?
You know, if I would like to think of this book as a manual for young reporters, as career advice, one of the major lessons you see from these very, very early women who really did not have this possibility and yet made it happen anyway, they are master networkers, starting with Fuller. So she decides that the most brilliant man in America is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and by hook or by crook, she is going to become his friend. And of course, he wants nothing to do with her. He's heard about her great gift of discourse, but he hears how off-putting she is. He sees that she has these awful quirks. She like bats her eyes constantly, and her gab is too full of gossip and things that really don't interest him. But his wife, this is another thing, the wives come into the play to help. She invites her to spend a fortnight at their home in Concord. And Margaret conquers him during that 2 weeks. She really conquers him and his wife, and they become fast friends. So that helps. Remember, they're in the transcendental movement. So there's a community of influential people, Thoreau. I mean, it's Nathaniel Hawthorne. I mean, it's a pretty great group, including Horace Greeley, whose wife, Mary, is enchanted by Margaret Fuller and is coming down to Boston to participate in her conversations, these events she's holding to help women learn to think. And Mary Greeley gets the idea that Horace needs a new literary editor. She convinces him to hire Margaret, who's been working at the Dial for Emerson. Not his first choice, but the choice he took. She did it for 2 years. And then Greeley hires her. And of course, she's writing about literature, and she's writing about, Goethe, and she's writing about all sorts of things like that, new books, etc. And then she decides after a very short time, like 2 months, that she wants to cover the underclass in New York. She wants to see what's happening among the disadvantaged. So she starts making tours of all the charitable agencies that are working with underprivileged groups. She's especially interested in prostitutes.
Wow.
Like has a real interest in prostitutes, which she's picked up when she was in Ossining and visiting Sing Sing, where women were imprisoned mostly as prostitutes. So that, created a fascination with that subject. Then after a couple of years, she decides she'd like to go off to Europe and cover the Italian Revolution, which she does. Amazing. So yeah, so it's the consummate career. It's like it's got everything.
If she could do it back then I mean, we have to tell ourselves now when we feel discouraged that, if she could do it back then, what's there to hold us back?
So,
I mean, you mentioned about how
here's the rub, though. There is a rub. And the rub is that women like Margaret Fuller were so exceptional. They were exceptional in their surpassing genius. I mean, they had, in the case of Mittie Morgan, who comes along about 30 years later, she's an equestrian. She's a livestock expert. How does she get hired at the New York Times as the livestock reporter? Because she knows more than anybody else. That can be your way. Or going to Europe during World War I or World War II, languages, having languages, things that other people didn't have. So there's always been this incredible exceptionalism that has existed from the beginning. Women got opportunity. The big difference was that those women, I've said this a few times, but those women were A+++, and a man could be B+ and have those opportunities. A woman could not.
Right. You
Or
mentioned,
she would end up, with a law degree on the fashion pages, which we hear at the Times in the late 50s and early 60s. I mean, like that. Like that.
absolutely. And you talked about in the book a lot about how so many women were relegated to the women's section, fashion, childcare,
Family, hope, furnishings, etc. Now, think about that. These were very important to business because this brought department store ads, it brought perfume ads, it brought elixir ads, it brought all kinds of revenue. So somebody had to produce that copy. Do you think any of the newspaper men in these very, relatively small shops wanted to write that stuff? They didn't. So this is how women got in the door. And of course, it's not so far-fetched to think, okay, I can get in this way and I can segue myself out. Only there was no out because there was no one to replace them to do that work, especially when they were good at it, and they were good at it. They were.
Well, as you also mentioned, some women did find their way into other places and other roles, even where you think it would be the most difficult, combat, war zones. How much was that due to freelancing? I mean, you talk about freelancing as
I do.
a way to get in the door.
That was a way in, and it was a way to get stuck, because rarely did you move to a full-time position if you started as a freelancer in war. Though it happened sometimes, but sometimes it would take 3 or 4 wars to get to that point.
Wow.
So that was very typical. People would say, if you want to make it in journalism, find a war. I mean, this was a thought. And there's an element of adventurism in this sometimes. We see this at the Spanish Civil War. I tell the story of Francis Davis, who is working for small Massachusetts newspapers, doing the sort of thing a woman would be doing out of BU, Boston University, probably with a comm degree. And I don't know what kind of a degree she had, but I'm guessing that's what it was. And she's miserable, and she wants to go have the big European adventure. So she takes herself to Paris. And of course, she couldn't get anybody even to give her a string, from any of the papers she worked for or anybody she contacted. But she takes advice from Dorothy Thompson, who is the real it girl of the 1930s of journalists. I mean, really the most stunning career imaginable. She and Anne O'Hare McCormick just, surpass everyone. And so Dorothy Thompson suggests she set up her own little syndicate. So she does that. She gets about 12 clients, and she's writing these little stories, from Paris and sending them back. In the meantime, she ingratiates herself with the permanent press corps, all the big shots, Paul Moore of the Chicago Daily News, I mean, whoever's based in Paris. And she becomes like a mascot kind of to them. Then suddenly one day, word comes that the Spanish Civil War is starting, and all the men run to get to the border, to the French border with Spain. And so she does the same thing. She has no idea what the war's about. She doesn't know a thing. She just knows she's going to go. So she shows up there, and as I say, they kind of treat her like a mascot, I think. And so they offer her a place in one of their chauffeured cars, and they give her false papers like they all have to get beyond the border. And she just is envying them, their urgency and the copy they've got to get out. And she's got all these little things to paste stamps onto. And so one day she gets the idea that she can be really useful. So she says, give me all your copy. She puts it in her girdle, and she spirits it across the border. They give her also telephone fees, because you can imagine how expensive they were. And she calls all of their offices and dictates all the copy. In the course of doing that, the London Daily Mail gives her a string. So she gets actually a platform and kind of moves from there. And then, not too long, she also gets a US one for the other side. So she doesn't sound like a patriot mouthpiece, and which, she kind of figured out after a while. And then some really horrific things happen to her, but I'll save that for the book.
Let me also mention, if anyone is listening and wants to ask a question, please write it in the chat and we'll try to get to that as well. Yeah, women, you see them taking these opportunities and the inventiveness that many of them use to make a name for themselves. Of course, you've written, you wrote about Nelly Bly even before this book. You did a whole book on her, I know, and she's such an amazing character that I feel like we can't ignore her. Going undercover in the mental institution, how revolutionary was that to kind of do an undercover thing? Was that
Yeah,
was
it was
pretty
a big
new
deal.
then, right?
He wasn't the first. I mean, there was a man who had done it about 10 years earlier who actually was an editor at The World. So
Okay.
it's hard to say who that idea came from. You know, success has many mothers. Everybody takes credit for the idea. So it's not entirely clear, but we know that there were rumors of abuses on Blackwell's Island that were already in the press, you know, that maybe doctors or nurses were abusing patients. So there was already interest in finding a way to get someone inside. When Nellie showed up in the office, she had offered to go steerage across the Atlantic to see what it was like to make that passage, you know, with no money, like as so many immigrants were doing in the 1880s. And so they thought that was too expensive and too risky. So instead, they send her to an insane asylum where she poses as mad. Her predecessor did not do that. He actually had, the superintendent was on board with the ruse. So he comes in without having to do any of that. She goes through a whole mad woman scenario, gets herself committed, and stays 10 days to really examine conditions. So that's what was unusual about what she did, remarkable. She was 23 years old. You know, the fear of it, this new American girl doing this remarkable thing all played into what gave her really instant celebrity. And week after week after week for the next 2.5 years, she is performing stunt after stunt after stunt, always with a social agenda. She's not just doing frivolous things. She's seeing if the prison matrons abuse prisoners. You know, she gets herself arrested. She investigates the baby buying trade. She investigates bribery in Albany. I mean, she really does serious stuff. But what's really amazing, Kristen, is that her entire reputation, which we still cotton on to, represents a career of 2.5 years after 2.5 previous years in the field. So she is barely a journeyman. And then the rest of her journalism life is very itinerant. You know, every once in a while she does some big splashy story. She interviews Emma Goldman when she's arrested, the anarchist. She goes to the Pullman strike in Chicago, you know, this big worker strike, and does it from a really interesting angle. She goes to interview the families. Mm-hmm. You know, so this whole idea of the humanitarian aspect of things has already been pioneered by this point. So she was fantastic, but really, we really remember her for 2.5 years. And of course, it culminates in this gargantuan trip around the world, trying to beat the fictional record of Phileas Fogg. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's a great character, but I've already written a lot about her. Yeah. So she's in the book. She's in the book. She is. She's in the book.
I wonder, do you think there were certain subjects that men were avoiding, and was it because they didn't appreciate the, you know, what blind spots were they that women were able to
move into?
Capitalize.
Well, I don't think it's so much that it was blind spots. Sometimes there was simple prohibition. Like in World War II, women were forbidden, which is not to say plenty of women did not ignore this, because they did, but by and large, the threat was court martial, house arrest, or, you know, expulsion for going anywhere near the front. They were not allowed to go any further front than the WACs or the nurses, which was way behind battle lines, way behind. So several women, especially wire service reporters, not all of them, but some, were sent to be newspapermen. So they were ignoring this simply because they were asked by their companies to do so, and they were up to it. Mm-hmm. They had the background. they were able to. A lot of the women who were sent in World War II were feature writers, or coming from women's pages to do more civilian kind of work, or to look at the conditions for the soldiers in the camps, or, how are they being fed? How are they being clothed? What are their circumstances? Because the feeling of the War Department was that every man had 4 women at home who were concerned about what was happening to him. So you have a mother, a sister, a lover, and a grandmother, or whatever. And so this news became important to bring the story home in ways that was, beyond the battlefield. So women were asked to do that, were good at that, and that's what many of them were doing when they went. But what I add to that is to say, and that's what they were equipped to do. They didn't have the training. The men usually went with training, and so did the women who took up those battle jobs in spite of the regulations. And then, of course, there's the fantastic story of Martha Gellhorn, stowing away on D-Day in a hospital ship with a flask in the bathroom, and beats everyone to the beach.
Amazing.
And writes the story we remember.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What?
And loses her credentials for doing so. So she spends the rest of the war without rations, without accreditation, without anything, and does not stop.
That's dedication.
Yeah.
We see throughout history women championing other causes, especially for African Americans. How important do you think was that, or how would you describe that relationship, I guess, in terms of promoting each other, I guess? Did women advance before women of color, certainly, but even before men of color in print, I would say, even though men had the vote first.
I guess so. I mean, you'd have to look at relative figures. There get to be more women in the field than men or women of color, for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that race and gender were an interesting through line from the beginning.
Yeah.
In those very early days, you find that after Margaret Fuller, Lydia Marie Child for one, and then the women who come next, who I highlight, Grace Greenwood, Gail Hamilton, they they ingratiated themselves into the abolition press, where they found place because the abolition press didn't have any money. So it was open to hiring people who were not the alpha males, alpha white males, basically. And the great thing about doing that for them was that everybody read the abolition press. So their work got seen. So from there, Grace Greenwood starts writing for the New York Times. Gail Hamilton writes for the Atlantic for the rest of her working life, another 4 decades. I mean, remarkable careers were built by that start, just being having enslavement be an important part of abolition, being an important part of their brief. And then later on, I made an exception in this book, because mostly this book is really about the most exceptional women who were doing jobs men would envy. I mean, my editor didn't like me to talk about it that way, but that's really what the book is about. Mm-hmm. It's about women who were doing men's jobs that men would like to have been doing instead of them, basically, during, we're talking about up to the 1990s, let's say, when things do start to change a bit, and quite a bit, but it takes a while. It takes a really long time.
Yeah.
So I made an exception with the Black press simply because there was no entry into the white mainstream elite press. There was virtually no entry. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was really important to highlight people like Ida B. Wells, because she became a national figure with that kind of wide recognition. And then there were others before her, like Gertrude Mosel, who you never hear about. She was the wife of a Philadelphia physician, and she wrote for both the white and the Black press, and wrote a book about how African American women could break into journalism. So, I found place for numerous characters like that. I made a real point of not separating them out. I really felt like they're just part of the continuum of women, because this book is about women. It's about women of all kinds.
And you talk about the steps that are made just by their sheer force of will and being there. But then there were some court decisions, some Title IX, I guess. There was the new, maybe I should ask the question, what are some of the changes, the changes legally
thing
that helped and made a difference?
Sure. The big thing that happens is the civil rights legislation of the mid 1960s. And what's most interesting to me about that is that it takes the women until the early 1970s to realize that that legislation could be an instrument for them in their confrontations with which weren't even confrontations, they were very mild, with their employers, that they could use these as legal instruments. But think how deep the conditioning had to be, and the sense of self, which was, I'll work till I get my marriage degree, I'm not supposed to have a career. I mean, it was that kind of thinking in the 60s that was really conditioning from their families, from their own sense of what they thought they were meant to do in life. And so when those changes start happening around 1963, and we really see the world change. I mean, I have a story that's not in the book that I kind of like telling, because I found out later when Barbara Walters died. So she dies in December, and my book was already like almost off to the printer. I mean, it was almost there. There was like one more chance to get a sentence in that she had died. And she's not a major figure in this book, but of course she's a figure. I mean, she would have to be because of just what she represents. She's not the first, because Pauline Frederick, right there at the UN where you are, was, a very big deal 15 years earlier. So I do a lot with Pauline Frederick, the more forgotten character. Anyway, so after Barbara Walters dies, I've told this story already, so I hope it's not repeating to people, but I think it's so important. It's 1962. Barbara Walters is on the writing staff. She's not even on the air yet on the Today Show, but she's striving to get there, because she's had a really long road to try to get somewhere in television. She started as a secretary, and then she moves to do a production job. And I mean, she just is really taken a long time to get on the air. And so the Playboy Club comes to New York. Have you heard this already? If you heard it, I'll stop. What? No, but it's such a good
tell the story. I mean,
okay.
So because we think of Gloria Steinem with the
wait, I'm going to get there. So, so it's 1962 December. The Playboy Club opens, and NBC does a little puff piece about the Playboy Club, and they send Barbara, who's not even on staff yet and not on air yet, in a bunny costume to kind of, say what this bunny life is like. Yeah. So she learns to do the bunny dip, and she talks about the matron and what the application process is like, and blah, blah, blah. And then she leaves early, and the doorman says to her, "You're leaving early." And she goes, "I'm not a bunny. I am a correspondent for the National Broadcasting Network," like that. I mean, you can see the clip, it's online. And I wrote a post about it that's on my website. But I just thought this was so interesting, because I'd already done a lot of work on Gloria Steinem when I wrote the book on undercover reporting. So I knew a lot about that. And then I looked back at Gloria's work, and I had forgotten that it was done like a diary. So it says Tuesday, the 14th, and then, or whatever date it is. But going back to look at the calendar, it had to be February, because that was the only 14th that was a Tuesday, or whatever day it was. Sorry, the recall's not coming. But anyway, it was 6 weeks later, only 6 weeks later, that she is doing an expose. It's also the same month that The Feminine Mystique is published. So there's been a lot of writing about that. And then 2 months later, when the piece appears in Show magazine, because of course magazines take a long time to get their stuff out in those days, the Equal Pay Act passes. So it's like that moment in 1910 where Virginia Woolf says, "The world changed, modernism happened." And you kind of feel that same thing in the course of 6 weeks, 2 months. Everything has changed. Right. So I love that story.
Yeah, I mean, it really does show the focus of the moment at that time.
It was the moment.
But nonetheless, I was just amazed the names when it comes to television reporters, my business, that the groundbreakers are still working, a lot of them. I mean, this was so recent. You talk about Judy Woodruff.
Oh, yeah. Leslie Stahl.
Leslie Stahl is still out there. I mean, Katie Couric. to some
absolutely.
extent, and
She's
these,
a little younger. Yeah, she's a little
yeah,
younger. There's a wonderful little passage in the book where the women at 40 are coming under real concern that they're going to be thrown off the air. And there's a lot of rumors about it, and they're really concerned. And so one of the women's magazines did a piece about it and did quite a bit of really good reporting. And there's this passage where Leslie Stahl says, I'm in my prime. I'm at the crest, like I'm going on for a long time. And of course, that turns out to be true. So good for her.
right. We're coming up on our half-hour mark. I actually wanted to start by asking you this question. Maybe I'll end with it.
Sure.
What did you have any role models when you decided to be a journalist? How did you get into
Nelly Bly.
Yeah, so you know about it.
I mean, yeah, Lois Lane. I mean, of course I had role models, those people.
Yeah.
I read a childhood biography of Nelly when I was 9, and I thought, oh, that's something I could do. So that seemed really clear to me. And I'm not alone in that. When that book came out in 1994, to tell you how very old I am, and I wasn't young when I did that, I can't tell you how many reviewers the reviews started with the words, "When I was a girl of 10." So I was not alone in that.
Yes, indeed. Well, Brooke, thank you so much for this chat. There's so much more we could talk about. There's so much more in the book. I would certainly encourage people to get it, check it out, especially women journalists. There's a lot of inspiration there, a lot to learn from, and obviously we still have a long way to go. We didn't even talk about the difficulties of getting into management positions, which is probably one of the lingering issues for women. And
well, not so much. No, women are flooding management positions, which I think is, if you read the book, you'll understand why I think that's very concerning.
Right, because it's when the ship's going down that the women get opportunities, right?
And that is absolutely the way it has been historically.
And sadly, there are a lot of headwinds for the journalism industry right now, aren't there? Oh gosh, I have so many things I'd like to talk to you about. Somebody wants to know what your advice is for aspiring female foreign correspondents today.
Oh, read that book, because it is so full of foreign correspondents. And I have lots of them in there who have a wire service background like mine, infantry, not famous, but really doing remarkable work. So I say, I'm not to pump the book, get it from the library, but this book is a career manual, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
My pleasure.
Everyone who joined us. We will share this link later. And remember the Foreign Press Association. We are an association for US-based foreign correspondents who work for overseas outlets. Please consider joining the FPA if you're not already a member. And we'll be back with more good stuff in the coming weeks. So we hope to
thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.